I think it's time we take a short field trip for lab. What I'd like to do is take you guys out west, at least metaphorically, and show you some of the charismatic mammals, talk about them a little bit, and then also show you some of the landscapes. These are the sorts of things that require that instead of just getting on the interstate and driving from one end of the country to the other, you actually stop and get out and get on your feet and look around a little bit. Um, I hope that what you see will sort of inspire you to take the time to go out west. It doesn't have to be out west. You can find equally dramatic mammals, birds, herps, fish, whatever. If you go any direction, you're probably familiar with the landscapes and so on around Missouri and the Midwest. But if you get out of that comfort zone and go to other parts of the country, I think it'll broaden your worldview, and you'll have, I think, a better appreciation for what nature really is. So let's begin with squirrels. We'll talk about some tree squirrels and ground squirrels. And we'll start by looking at an animal whose common name is the fairy diddle, also known as a red squirrel. This is not a fox squirrel. This is actually in the genus Tamiasciurus. It's Tamiasciurus hudsonicus. Every now and then we'll get them in Missouri. Whenever the Mississippi River freezes over, we can get some coming across from over in Illinois. But this is typically a species that you find in coniferous forests, not in the hardwood deciduous forests that we have. So this is a species that is feeding primarily on mast and especially on cones. One of the things that this species does is it builds these very large middens. The midden consists of just huge stockpiles of cones from spruce trees. And it'll actually go out onto the tips of branches and clip off the cones, or even clip off the tips of the branches to sort of modify how the tree is growing. So what the squirrel is trying to do is bioengineer the tree so that the tree puts more energy into reproduction and less energy into the growth of the tree. At any rate, the squirrels build these huge middens, and they stockpile them for the winter, and then they dig their little burrows and dens and live inside of these middens. Now, one cool aspect of these middens is that as you walk through the forest, you can see these piles, and each pile will belong to a different red squirrel. There was a fellow from Colorado who was watching these red squirrels work on their middens, and he noticed that sometimes there would be visitors, so other squirrels visiting middens that didn't belong to them. So what he did was he went down to the hardware store or Walmart or wherever and bought a large quantity of little push pins. Some were red, blue, green, yellow, so all sorts of different colors. And he went to all these middens, and on each midden he would push these little push pins into some of the cones. So each midden had its own color code. And then he just came back in a few weeks and he looked at all of the middens. And what he discovered was that there were a few middens that had multicolored cones on them. So obviously what had happened, there were some squirrels that were kleptoparasites. In other words, they would go visit other middens that didn't belong to them, steal some cones that had push pins in them, and then stockpile them on their own middens. So he wrote a rather interesting paper on kleptoparasitism in red squirrels, but it illustrates the importance of these middens to the squirrels. They rely on these things to get through the winter, not only as a source of food, but also as these things begin to decay, they give off some heat and they keep the squirrels warm even when there's rather significant snowpack on the ground. So the fact that some animals are cheating, right, they're kleptoparasitic, is exactly what you would expect evolutionarily. You find that in all species, including humans, right? There are lots of humans that cheat. that take things that don't belong to them, right? So when it comes right down to it, all organisms are basically selfish. They're looking out for their own good. They're not doing necessarily what's right and wrong. They're doing what's good or best for them in an evolutionary sense. Now, you've already looked at a short video clip of behavior for the yellow-bellied marmots. Yellow-bellied marmots are a relatively common species throughout much of the western United States. They're generally associated with either talus or rocky outcrops, someplace where they can establish a kind of a den. And what these animals are doing is, you can see the den right behind this animal. He retreats to that den for safety, and then will come and bask on this little ledge right in front of his den. But these animals, they are ground squirrels, so they are sciurids. The genus is Marmota, and hence the common name marmot. And this particular marmot is Marmota flaviventris, so the yellow-bellied marmot. It's in the same genus as the woodchuck or groundhog that we have here in Missouri, which is Marmota monax. One difference between our groundhog and these marmots is that our groundhogs are solitary, so they're not social. Yellow-bellied marmots, on the other hand, are highly social. So you'll have family units that are living in the same den. And one consequence of that, too, is that these animals practice vigilance. So they are alert, they're looking out for potential predators, and they give alarm calls when they spot a potential predator. There's some evidence to suggest that the alarm calls that they give are threat specific. That is, they have different alarm calls if it's a ground-born predator like a fox or a coyote or something like that, and something else if it's a bird like a hawk or whatever. Interestingly, because the habitat for yellow-bellied marmots is somewhat fragmentary, you don't find these large continuous stretches of talus or rocky outcrops to support them. Their populations tend to be fragmented, and one of the consequences of population fragmentation is a reduction in gene flow. And what that then potentially leads to is fixation of some alleles, and you can see that here. This is a melanistic yellow-bellied ground squirrel, so instead of having that golden brown color on its surface, it's almost entirely black. Now, we refer to them as being ground squirrels, and they are. They have relatively short legs and relatively short tails, which is characteristic of ground squirrels. But clearly the animal is capable of arboreality, so it is able to climb. Now, this photograph was taken on September 1st, a number of years ago. And the reason this photograph is sort of interesting, this is in southern Utah, and this was the last day that these marmots were active. So the subsequent day I came back to film these animals, and they were all gone. Yellow-bellied marmots are active basically from May until the end of August. And in spite of the fact that there is still plenty of grass and forbs and vegetation for these guys to consume, they stop feeding and they go underground. So they are essentially going into hibernation from the end of August, from the 1st of September, all the way until the following May. That's a long time to spend underground. What's even more interesting is the fact that they don't simply go into hibernation and then come out of it at the end of the season. The first point is that these animals realistically are too large to go into hibernation. In general, animals that are bigger than, say, 800 grams are not capable of going into hibernation. And yes, that means that bears do not hibernate. They do not. They go into something called estivation or torpor, but they do not hibernate. These animals, on the other hand, in spite of their relatively large size, are able to go into hibernation. And to make matters more interesting, they come out of hibernation almost on a daily basis. And the expensive part of hibernation is coming out of hibernation. So there's a lot that we don't understand about the physiology of these animals. Now, one other important point is that the reason they're going into hibernation so early is because the vegetation that is still available this late in the season has so little nutritional value that it actually costs them more to feed on this than they get in return by consuming it. So it's a cost-benefit analysis. At this point in the season, this late, feeding, basking, being exposed to predation just simply isn't worth it. They're not getting enough calories out of the food they consume to make it worth it to still be active. So they simply go into hibernation. Now, the next image that you see here illustrates why it's so important for these animals to be vigilant. This is late spring in the Tetons. There was still an abundant snowpack, and as a matter of fact, it was still snowing off and on over the next week or so. This is a red fox, a gray face of a red fox, coming down a slope, and you'll notice that it has a yellow-bellied marmot in its jaws. The interesting thing was this particular fox walked right past me, carrying this marmot down the slope, stashed the marmot in its den, came back up the slope, and attempted to get a second marmot, and wasn't successful as far as I could tell. But clearly, the number of predators that are out there feeding on these marmots is extensive. So everything from hawks all the way to foxes and snakes and things of that sort. So it ain't easy being a yellow-bellied marmot. They've got to be on their toes. They've got to watch out for the bad guys, so to speak. Here is a hoary marmot. This photograph was taken in Denali, up in Alaska. And the growing season in Alaska is obviously very brief. So most of the year you're under snow and the weather conditions are extreme. So these animals have a very short period of time in which they need to get all of life's business taken care of. So they feed rather frantically. They don't pay much attention to potential predators. Everything that they're doing is geared towards feeding, putting some mass on their bodies, getting all the reproductive business taken care of, and so on. And what that means is that it's possible to get pretty close to these guys before they pay any attention at all to you. I was able to get within probably 10 feet of this animal before he even paid attention to my existence, and within 6 feet before he moved off into a different direction. But it is a gorgeous animal. The pelt is very thick and luxurious, but it is also in the genus Marmota, and it is also a marmot. There are other marmot species. There is the Olympic marmot to the south in Washington on the Olympic Peninsula. And then there is another marmot in Alaska as well. If you go into Eurasia, there are a whole series of other marmots across Siberia and Russia and so on. So it's a rather cool genus. They do a lot of interesting things. And as you can see from the images here, there's a lot of social interaction that's taking place. These marmots are all social. And we know very little about the social structure of these guys and all of the special little behaviors that they go through to communicate. Obviously, here there's a meet and greet going on. There's social grooming, allo grooming and things of that sort. We know very little about all of that. And of course, one reason for that is that in this particular environment, it's very hard to do that kind of work, simply because the conditions can be so severe. This is another ground squirrel. It's a Colombian ground squirrel. The taxonomy on these guys has changed again and again and again over the last 40 years or so. So it's a little bit challenging to keep up with. They were initially in the genus Cytellus, then they were in the genus Spermophilus, and I think now they're I can't even recall what the current genus is, but it is a Colombian ground squirrel. They have a distribution which is through the Rockies and the Northwest up into Canada. One of the interesting things about these animals is that they also have a relatively short activity season. There is a woman in Canada who has spent her entire professional career watching a colony of these guys outside her kitchen window, and her entire research career has been based on this population outside of the window of her farmhouse in Alberta, Canada. And she has detailed data on this that is just pretty spectacular data set. But one thing that we know is that they are sexually dimorphic, but the sexual dimorphism is reversed. That is, the females are larger than the males. And surprisingly, the males weigh about 500 grams or so. The females are up at about 800 grams. So in spite of the fact that the females are as large as they are still able to go into hibernation. So they are at that critical upper limit of how big an animal can be and still go into hibernation. They do a lot of activities underground. They do not come out of hibernation at the same time. The males come out of hibernation first. Females come out of hibernation later. But there are some interesting social things that are going on with these. They also practice vigilance. So they also have to watch out for predators. They need to watch out for ferrets. They need to watch out for hawks. They need to watch out for snakes, for foxes, for badgers, for coyotes, and so on. So life is not easy for a Columbian ground squirrel. This is a snowshoe hare, and it's clear why it's called a snowshoe hare. These things go through a molt early in the spring and then a molt in late summer. Throughout the winter, they are solid white. But in the summer, they will have a nice brown pelage, and the feet are the last to turn. So here this animal still has this nice white furry feet. These guys are actually pretty cool. This photograph was also taken in Denali in Alaska. And I was able to get within just a few feet of this animal. This animal was so busy feeding, he just completely ignored me. And that makes sense because the growing season is so short. You can't really worry too much about predation if your main objective is to survive through the upcoming winter and, of course, get all your reproductive work done in the meantime. A little bit farther south in the Tetons, this is a pika. Pikas are also in the mammalian group Lagomorpha. The Lagomorpha are divided into two families, the Ocotonidae, which are the pikas, and then the Leporidae, which are the hares and rabbits. So this is a pika. It is essentially a rabbit with little rounded ears and about a guinea pig-sized body. These guys are cool because they live in rocky crevices in the talus slopes in large colonies. One of the reasons why we as ecologists are so interested in them is because they are a good indicator species for climate change. So they have very specific environmental requirements, and as the Earth warms, as the climate changes, they are forced up in elevation. And of course, if you go too much higher in elevation, you run out of talus slope, and of course, you run out of mountaintop. So they are a good indicator, and there's a fair bit of work mapping the distributions of these guys as sort of a way to keep tabs on what's happening with climate change. Now, these animals also practice vigilance, and they also are highly social, and they give out alarm calls as well. So if you're interested in working on vigilance behavior, this is a very cool species to work on. And of course, they live in a habitat which is just pretty spectacular. This is a golden mantled ground squirrel. These are pretty common across much of the Mountain West. Although these animals are relatively abundant, they're more difficult to work on behaviorally than a lot of other species. And the reason for that is because they get habituated to the presence of humans relatively easily. When you're out hiking on a trail, if it's an area where people walk by on a pretty regular basis, these animals pay virtually no attention to you at all. And if you take a picnic and you're sitting down on a rock, these animals learn very quickly that you have chips or peanuts or whatever it is that you're snacking on, and they'll come up and take it right out of your hand. So they're fun. They're fun to watch. Perhaps a little more difficult to work on if you're trying to work on an animal in a natural setting. This is a chipmunk. Chipmunks have the white stripes above and below their eyes, as opposed to the golden mantled brown squirrels. And chipmunks also, at least in the southern Rockies, this photograph was taken in New Mexico in the Sandia Mountains. These guys are relatively easy to observe. They're not quite as easy to habituate as the golden-mantled ground squirrels. But they obviously have a lot of social stuff going on, as you can see from the image here where the two animals are interacting. But they are very cool. It's just another ground squirrel, so the ground squirrel size ranges from animals that are in the neighborhood of 50, 60, 70 grams or so, all the way up to animals that are in the 5 kilo range or more. If you travel west from Missouri and go through Kansas and get all the way over to the extreme western part of Kansas and then head north, so in the northwestern part of Kansas, there is a state park called Prairie Dog State Park. Now you'll notice as you're driving along Interstate 70 that you will see these mounds on either side of the road. As you see these little bare dirt mounds. Those mounds are actually prairie dog mounds. And one of the things that has happened with prairie dogs, obviously, is that there has been a huge effort on the part of ranchers to exterminate the prairie dogs, and that turns out to be misguided. It turns out that cattle do much better on land that has prairie dogs on it than they do on land without, and the reason for that is the bioengineering on the part of the prairie dog. So what the prairie dog is doing is essentially changing the composition of the vegetation on the land, and it ends up making the land much more productive, and that, of course, benefits the cattle. The argument that the ranchers use is that the holes that are dug by the prairie dogs are dangerous, and that the cattle break their ankles or their feet, and that turns out not to be true. There have been a number of studies that have shown that cattle actually break their legs less often on land that has lots of prairie dogs than on land that doesn't have prairie dogs. You've looked at these little video clips of prairie dogs, so you know that they have sort of a rich behavioral repertoire. They are cool, they are social, they do give all the alarm calls and practice vigilance and all of that sort of stuff. So it is another interesting species to work on. One of the reasons why they are so important ecologically, aside from the fact that they increase the productivity of the land, is that they are the primary food source for black-footed ferrets. And with the efforts to exterminate prairie dogs in the West, that resulted essentially in the demise of the black-footed ferret. There have been huge efforts to reestablish black-footed ferrets with some success. At one point, all black-footed ferrets were brought into captivity, so the ferrets that you see in the wild now are essentially products of these breeding programs out of perhaps 16 to 20 individuals, and that's it. So one of the major concerns is genetic variation that exists within the black-footed ferret population, and that's something that is still a problem. One interesting note about the mounds that are built by the prairie dogs is they are sort of entire little ecocosms all to themselves. And if you're in the Dakotas, in South Dakota in particular, if you visit these prairie dog mounds at night, what you discover is that most of these mounds have living within them not just the prairie dogs, but also tiger salamanders. So it's one of the easiest ways to collect tiger salamanders is to go visit these prairie dog mounds. What the commensal relationship is between the prairie dogs and the tiger salamanders, I don't know, other than the fact that the prairie dog is providing a nice microhabitat for the tiger salamanders. Of course, the other issue with prairie dogs is plague. They carry syphilitic plague, so there are lots of efforts to dust these prairie dogs and to dust the towns in an effort to control plague, because the plague can be transmitted to other organisms as well. Let's head west from Missouri into New Mexico. So let's drop down to Interstate 40 and just continue straight across all the way to the center of New Mexico. As you do that, one of the things that you realize is that you're slowly gaining altitude up until you reach the crest of the Sandia Mountains and cross through that to Harris Pass. That gentle slope is pretty dramatic once you hit the crest because it drops off rather precipitously. This is an image taken from the top of the Sandia Mountains looking out over Albuquerque. So you're above the clouds. Albuquerque itself is at about a mile in elevation, so 5,200 feet, something like that. And Sandia Crest, I think the highest point along Sandia Crest is about 11,000 feet. So it is a pretty dramatic vista from that point. To the east, to the east of Albuquerque, behind where this image is taken, there was at one time a large inland sea, so that was all marine habitat, which, with the shifting of the tectonic plates, produced the Sandia Mountains, and Albuquerque's on one side, and what is now this large mesa is on the other side. One of the things you notice when you're up there, though, is the dramatic change in vegetation. So on top of the mountains here, you can be in the ponderosa pines and the aspens and some pinyon pine and things of that sort. And down below, it's all going to be sagebrush and mesquite and manzanita and things of that sort. When you're up on the crest, one of the things that you notice is that many of the trees have these rather bizarre shapes. This is a pinyon pine, which is obviously very stunted, and you can tell that the wind has been blowing in one direction. There's another example of that here. This is referred to as the Krummholz effect. Krummholz is a German word. Krumm means crooked, and Holz is wood, so the crooked wood effect. And this is simply caused by this persistent wind going in one direction. As the air over Albuquerque warms up, especially in the summer, this warm air mass rises and then blows over the top of the crest and cascades over towards the east. And that persistent wind essentially erodes away all the new vegetation which is growing or which attempts to grow towards the west, and the material that's sheltered on the east side of the tree is protected and persists. Let's head north from New Mexico up into the Dakotas. So we'll skip through Colorado and head right up into the Dakotas. Well, not right up, but over and up. This is in southeastern South Dakota. This is an area referred to as Wind Cave National Park, and that butts up right against Custer State Park, which is a reserve for bison and pronghorn antelope. The pronghorn antelope are the only true antelopes. When we refer to antelopes, typically people are referring to African antelopes, which are not really antelopes. The antelopes are in the family Antilocapridae, and that's strictly a North American family, and there is but one species in the family. They are unique in the sense that they have horns that are unlike those of any other animal. Horns consist of a bony core and then a keratinaceous sheath, as opposed to antlers, which have a bony core and then are covered with velvet, at least temporarily. And antlers are shed, horns are not. but in pronghorns, they will sometimes shed the carotinaceous sheath. So it is a North American species. They are iconic. They essentially define the western plains. Custer State Park and Wind Cave National Park are at the southern extent of the Black Hills. And if we travel north from there into the northern Black Hills, we enter a fundamentally different kind of habitat. The Black Hills are essentially an island habitat in a sea of badlands and lower plains. They are covered at lower elevations with ponderosa pine and at higher elevations with white spruce. Interestingly, there is a small mountain range just to the north of Black Hills referred to as the Bear Claw Mountains. But at any rate, the Black Hills support a population of northern flying squirrels, which is Glaucomys sabrinus. And it is an island population, so they are hundreds of miles from the next possible population of flying squirrels, surrounded by completely inhospitable habitat for flying squirrels. So it is really an island kind of a situation. Many of the species that you find in the Black Hills are coniferous forest species, so they've obviously been trapped there for millennia, since the last ice age at least, which makes the whole area extremely interesting from a biogeographic perspective. One of the species that you'll find in the Black Hills and throughout surrounding areas as well are mule deer. You're familiar with white-tailed deer, which is a much smaller kind of a deer. Mule deer are significantly larger. You can tell them by the presence of the toupee that they have on the top of their heads, and also by the fact that their ears are considerably larger. Unfortunately, mule deer are being displaced by an ever-expanding white-tailed deer population. So the white-tailed deer are much better at dealing with the presence of anthropogenic effects than are the mule deer. And because of the heavy human traffic in areas like the Black Hills, the white-tailed deer are able to move in and displace the mule deer. Now, in the Black Hills, you have areas with ponderosa pine at lower elevations and then also white spruce at higher elevations, but there is also an abundance of a variety of different birch species. There's quaking aspen, if you're a fan of the photography, the black and white photography of Ansel Adams, then you know how iconic the quaking aspen are, but also paperbark birch and things of that sort. One interesting note about aspen trees is if you get into a grove of aspens, particularly if it's something referred to as a dog hair patch. A dog hair patch of aspen is where the trees are so close together that you can't even walk through them. And it turns out that aspen reproduce not just sexually, they also reproduce asexually. So new trees will arise from the root systems of pre-existing trees. So when you're in a dog hair patch, you're in a patch of trees which are all genetically identical because they are essentially all the same individual. Now, I mentioned that there's a lot of white spruce, and in this particular area, this was a field site of mine a few years back, and I was there working on northern flying squirrels. And this particular patch of forest was just absolutely glorious. It hadn't been touched in many years. There were segments of it that were old growth. There's a lot of old man's beard there, which is usnea, which is an epiphytic, which is an epiphyte. It's essentially another plant which is growing out of the white spruce. Something similar to the kind of epiphytes that you see on live oaks when you're down in the southeast in New Orleans or something to that effect. At any rate, I returned to this field site ready to do some additional work one fall, only to discover that this entire area had been clear-cut. There's a lot of logging that goes on in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And in fact, I had a great deal of difficulty getting permits to work in the Black Hills simply because The area is so heavily managed for timber, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which manages the site, is reluctant to allow anybody to find evidence for species that might be endangered or imperiled, because they don't want to do anything to limit the amount of logging that is going on there. When they do logging in the Black Hills, any tree that has a DBH, a diameter at breast height of greater than 9 inches, is considered to be a mature tree, and something that they are allowed to harvest. And when they go in there, they don't simply do a little bit of thinning. They go in there and they will clear cut large stretches of this land. Any of the slash, so any of the branches, the lateral branches or trees that turn out to be too small, are pushed into these gigantic piles, these slash piles, and those are then burned at the end of the season. Let's continue further west, leave the Black Hills in South Dakota, and head straight across Wyoming to the extreme western end of Wyoming. And there we'll find the Tetons, and a little bit north of the Tetons, Yellowstone National Park. So it's Teton National Park, which receives less attention than Yellowstone, and then Yellowstone National Park, which butts up right against it. The Tetons are just absolutely stunning. It is a phenomenal landscape, and it receives much less attention than does Yellowstone. Most people go to Yellowstone and completely ignore the Tetons. One interesting thing for a biologist in the Tetons is that the University of Wyoming, in conjunction with the USDA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, maintain a field station right on the margins of this lake right here. It's called the AMK Field Station. And you can stay there if you have ongoing research. You can stay there relatively inexpensively. So instead of staying in a hotel in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, or something like that for several $100s a night, you can stay on the AMK Field Station for somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 a night. So it's excellent accommodations, and you're safe from the bears. There are plenty of grizzlies around, but if you're in the housing that's provided there, it's relatively easy. One of the nice things about being in the Tetons is the abundance of wildlife. Here is an osprey which has just taken a large fish out of Jenny Lake, and it's not an uncommon sight. Surrounding Jenny Lake, there are populations of yellow-bellied marmots, Uinta ground squirrels, and flying squirrels, and pikas, and snowshoe hares, and all sorts of wildlife. Lots of mule deer, elk, moose. So it is a pretty spectacular place. If you're into wildlife, it's a place that you should definitely visit. Easy digs. One of the significant components of both the Tetons and Yellowstone is the presence of bears. There are both black bears and grizzly bears, and there are also a lot of people, so bears and people don't mix very well. This female black bear, she has 2 cubs that are in a tree at the bottom of this hill. And there was a tourist which had stopped her vehicle and wanted to get a photograph of this black bear. And this tourist got out of her vehicle with her cell phone and wanted to take a picture of this black bear, and kept getting closer and closer and closer. And the bear was upset and didn't want this person getting any closer, and on a couple of occasions turned and took a few steps towards the tourist, and the tourist backed up a little bit. But then the tourist always wanted to get that perfect picture with her cell phone and just came too close. And ultimately this bear turned around and charged, and of course the woman dropped her purse and her phone and everything else and tried to scramble out of the way, and the bear just went right after her. And right before the bear got to her, the bear stopped and turned around and left her. And fortuitously, there was a USDA person that was driving by in a truck and saw the whole episode, and then right away consulted the woman and told her that it would be smarter if she were in her vehicle rather than trying to take photographs of the bear. So she ultimately did abandon her efforts. But the bears are unpredictable. Black bears, not as much as grizzlies, but when you encounter these animals, they're a heck of a lot bigger than you are, and they can really do you dirt. There is also an abundance of canids out there. So this is a red fox that is looking pretty mangy. And when you see coyotes and even wolves on in the Tetons or in Yellowstone, oftentimes you'll notice animals that have significant mange. So being in the wild is not necessarily an easy way to make a living as a mammal. A lot of these animals are heavily parasitized. A lot of them have mange. It's difficult to make it out there. This is rough habitat. They're cruel conditions, and yet these animals somehow manage to survive. If you're in wetland habitat, you'll see things like moose. Moose are always somehow associated with water. And this cow, we spotted her from the road, and she just right away started moving through this fen. And it's just a spectacular sight. These are big animals, and they can kill you without a second thought. I mean, you'd think that, well, it's just just another ungulate. It's going to be like a horse or a cow, and it is not. These animals are pretty scary when you get up close to them. And of course, weather conditions change pretty dramatically, regardless of what time of year it is. This photograph was taken in early June, and there's a sudden snowstorm that's kicked up. And this elk is just hunkering down, trying to deal with all the snow, and you can see that there is snow already accumulating on the back of this elk. And driving into the Tetons, this is in late May. Here's a female grizzly and her cub. The cub is probably 2 years old. They have extended parental care. These are big animals, and they are extremely unpredictable. They have long claws, and if you ever encounter one of these animals, every hair on your body is going to be standing on end. They are an animal to be respected. They don't mind taking down tourists. They don't mind ripping open your car to get at you. These are not animals to be messed with. And of course, in both Yellowstone and in the Tetons, there is an abundance of bison. And bison, too, are big animals. Everyone thinks that they're cows. They're not. The reason we don't ranch bison the way we ranch cows is because bison are exceedingly difficult to domesticate. They were hunted to almost extinction, and that happened in the 19th century. They have recovered rather dramatically. The ranchers that own property around the Tetons and Yellowstone would like nothing more than to exterminate the bison because they're concerned about a variety of different diseases that are harbored within bison. But the fact is that bison are there to stay, I think. A little bit more about the relationship between bison and wolves in a little while. One interesting component of the bison is when people are driving through, especially Yellowstone, and they see bison, they all want to get out and look and take their pictures and so on. And the bison don't necessarily behave in a pleasant way. There have been numerous cases just within the last year where people have been gored because they got too close to the bison. The bison will charge you. They'll charge your car. They will roll your car over. They are an animal that need to be respected. You should keep a good fair distance between you and those animals. All of the photographs that I have here were taken with very long lenses, so I have no intention of being gored by a bison. One of the remarkable things about Yellowstone National Park is that it is at the end of what's referred to as a caldera. If you were to look at satellite imagery of Yellowstone, you would notice that it's on the eastern edge of this giant C-shaped kind of geographic feature, and that C-shaped depression in the landscape is referred to as the caldera. In fact, what it is, it's the top of a volcano. And as the tectonic plate has shifted and rolled around, this the volcanic activity has stayed in place, but the continental plates have shifted. So it's essentially gorged out this letter C in the surface. And Yellowstone is at one extent of that. And at the other extent of that is Craters of the Moon National Park. And I will show you images of that in just a little bit. But it's sitting on the top of this volcanic structure, and there's a lot of venting that goes along, and that's what results in geysers and things of that sort. It also results in these pools, which are very, very, very hot and also very acidic. There are signs all over the place that say don't enter into these pools. You know, there are walkways that you're supposed to walk on and stay, you know, and little bridges and things of that sort that are supposed to contain the tourist. But invariably, somebody will want to dip their finger in or wade into one of these pools, and it never turns out well when that happens. Just a few years ago, there were a couple of teenagers that were at one of these pools, and one of them wanted to take a picture, dropped his phone, and then tried to retrieve the phone. And then by the next day, they finally fished out what was left of this person out of the pool. So the person had obviously died as a result of the high temperatures, and then because of the acidity, there wasn't much left of this teenager. So it is a pretty dramatic landscape. At the same time, there are algae within these pools. And in fact, roughly 30 some odd years ago, I was involved in a project with another CMO faculty member looking at what happened to the algae in these pools. Now, the water temperature is in some of the cooler pools is in the neighborhood of 90 degrees centigrade. So water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. At 90 degrees centigrade, that's quite hot, and yet there are algae in these pools. So we were doing a little study on succession. We were removing the algae and then over a period of several months looking at how the algae reestablishes itself. But at any rate, there is a notable difference between these algae and algae that you see in much cooler waters, and that is that if you look at the DNA that you find in these algae, it's comprised primarily of cytosine and guanine. And if you remember your biochemistry, cytosine and guanine have 3 hydrogen bonds between each nitrogenous base pair. Adenine and thymine have only 2. So it's that extra hydrogen bond which enables this DNA molecule to retain its integrity. Obviously, as temperatures go up, the hydrogen bonds are broken, right? Therefore, in order to retain the integrity of the molecule, you need extra hydrogen bonds, and you get that with the cytosine and guanine. So these algae are unique in the fact that they have such high quantities of cytosine and guanine. Now, within Yellowstone, there's this large central valley, and there has been a rather dramatic change in the vegetation within this valley, and that change is primarily a consequence of what's gone on with the wolves. In the absence of wolves, the elk and the caribou and the moose overwhelmed this particular valley because it was a safe place to be. If there are no wolves, they didn't have to worry about predators. And the consequence of that was that they were exploiting certain species of plants, and the entire vegetative structure of this valley changed as a result. With the reintroduction of the wolves and management of the wolf populations, the wolves are now moving into these valleys. And I don't know if I've used the term in class. I think I probably have, but we oftentimes think of the landscape of fear. So suddenly, with the reemergence of the wolves, there is now this landscape of fear, and the behavior of the bison and the elk and the moose and the caribou has changed rather dramatically. so that now they are much more likely to move off into the spruce, to move into higher ground, to move into areas where they aren't quite so exposed. And with that reduced foraging pressure on these meadows and on this valley, the vegetation has gone back to the way it was 100 years ago or so. Now, even within a landscape like Yellowstone, along these valleys and along these lake shores, you get these little rocky outcroppings, and it is truly surprising that on a rock outcrop like this, you'll find a population of yellow-bellied marmots. And in fact, one of my former graduate students, Jody Bradley, did much of her master's thesis research using this particular site as one of her study sites. But there is a population of yellow-bellied marmots there, surrounded by elk, surrounded by grizzly, surrounded by mule deer, and lots and lots and lots of tourists that are hiking by and so on. But there's that population of yellow-bellied marmots, totally isolated and quite some distance from the next possible population of yellow-bellied marmots. So obviously it's genetically isolated. Let's go just a little bit to the west of Yellowstone through an area that's referred to as Hell's Half Acre, and then on into Craters of the Moon National Park, the other end of the caldera. And here you can see that there is this volcanic crust which overlays everything. So this is presumably what Yellowstone will look like in another 20 million years or something like that, as this caldera shifts ever farther to the east and the north. But at any rate, here's an area that's dominated by some pinyon pine, some juniper, a lot of sagebrush. It is a dramatic landscape. It has its own unique beauty. It is perhaps not surprising that there are pikas. Well, it is surprising because it's not sort of typical pika habitat. You normally expect to find pika in mountainous areas where there's a lot of talus. There is no talus here, and it's obviously not mountainous. But you do have, because of this volcanic crust being broken up like that, you have the same kind of structural component. That is, lots of little cracks and crevices, places where the pikas can embed themselves. There is an active research project ongoing at Craters of the Moon National Park trying to understand what's going on with the pikas. It is an atypical habitat. It probably gets hotter than the normal sort of habitats where you find pikas. And of course, it's quite an extensive area, so it's possible that this might be one of the last bastions of pikas and after we've completed our episode with climate change. But it is a dramatic landscape. It has its own beauty. And if you've never had the chance to experience sagebrush, it is a very unique kind of plant. It's slow growing. It's a gnarly looking plant. This is Artemisia tridentata. The leaves have three little lobes on the tips. And after it's rained, that's when you really begin to smell these plants. They have sort of very unique kind of odor. It's a very pleasant odor. But this habitat is so dry, the only time you're going to smell it is if it's just rained. Another plant that is relatively common in this part of the world is something referred to as Indian paintbrush. I don't know why it's called Indian paintbrush. I know that the North American Indians used it to some extent, and I suppose it looks a little bit like a paintbrush. But it's characteristic of this particular habitat, and it is a very pretty little flower. Let's head straight north from Craters of the Moon National Park, right up through Idaho, all the way to the extreme northern tip of Idaho, so past Coeur d'Alene, up to a little town called Sandpoint, Idaho, which is right on the shores of Lake Pend Oreille. Lake Pend Oreille was used by the Navy to test submarines back before the Second World War. It is an insanely deep lake, and it is a pretty remarkable landscape. Unfortunately, Coeur d'Alene has become a refuge for a certain group of people. There's a strong anti-government sentiment up in that area, and it's safer to drive around in a vehicle that doesn't have government plates on it or official state plates, something of that sort. So it's an extremely conservative area. A lot of guns, a lot of private property signs, a lot of shoot first, ask questions later sort of signs. It's the sort of place where you have to pay attention to where the property boundaries are and what you look like and who you're with and so on. But it is still a glorious habitat. The lake is surrounded by people with money, so people with boats, people with money, and people with big vacation homes right on the shores of the lake. But if you can get past all of that and get into the forest, it looks very much like old growth. So the forest floor is pretty open, a lot of big trees, lots of flying squirrels, lots of tailed frogs, which is an ancient group of frogs, which is the reason we were there on this particular trip. A lot of grizzly bears as well. We set up, just for grins and giggles, we put up some camera traps and nailed some Kansas sardines to opposite trees, and discovered the next day back checking the camera that 15 minutes after we had left the site, there was a grizzly there mauling our can of sardines. So it is a pretty special kind of place. You need to pay attention to what you're doing. There are also bighorn sheep. These sheep were not taken from this area. These are actually from farther south. These are desert bighorns rather than mountain bighorns. Somewhere I have a photograph of mountain bighorns as well, but spectacular animals just the same. Ospreys as well, fishing on the lake. And if you get into the rivers in the area, you'll also discover things like harlequin ducks, which are perhaps the most glorious of all ducks. If you need them for your life list, that now you know where to go. Go to anywhere from Yellowstone farther north if you want to find those harlequin ducks. Lots of jays, lots of songbirds. It's just yellow-headed blackbirds and so on. It's just a glorious part of the country. Let's go south again through Utah and head down towards southern Utah. This is an area that is also dominated to some extent by sagebrush, but also by pine and spruce trees, hemlock, things of that sort. And some of these areas are in relatively high elevations. So I've been in some places in southern Utah where you're at an elevation of 12,000 feet, and yet all the vegetation is sagebrush. So it is sort of both geologically and biogeographically an interesting location. This particular area here, somewhere in here, there is a population of boreal toads. Boreal toads are a species that is threatened, and there are huge efforts in Utah to try and discover extant populations. So it's something that would be relatively straightforward to survey for if you have bioacoustic monitoring equipment. And the money is there if you're interested in doing that kind of work. But it is an interesting landscape. If you're there in the fall, it's lots of colors. If you're there in the spring, lots of wildflowers and migratory songbirds and things of that sort. There are aspens and spruce and hemlock and pine and so on. So it is a pretty dramatic place. So in closing, then I would just like to make a few comments. First, it's been a pleasure having you guys in class. It's unfortunate that we have to do it in the context of COVID-19. We were unable to get outside very much at all this semester, and that's too bad. But having said that, let me encourage you, whenever possible, to take advantage of opportunities to get outdoors, whether it's here in the Midwest or up north or back east or in the southeast or the southwest or the Pacific Northwest or the Rockies or the Sierras or whatever. Get out there and experience life. When you do that, use your eyes, look, watch, be patient, listen for things to come to you, pay attention to what animals are doing, pay attention to the plants that you see. Keep a field notebook. Keep a record of what you're seeing, where you see things, and use that field notebook as a tool as you develop your biological career. I have my field notes going all the way back to the early 1960s, and I page through it every now and then, and it's fun to read that, and some of the observations that I made then are still relevant today. Many of the field sites that I visited when I was a kid no longer exist, but some of them do, and it's fun to go back and look at those sites and see how they've changed. Pay attention. Oftentimes, the casual person will just walk right past something and not even realize how spectacular it truly is. Take the time to try and look. Be patient. Wait for things to happen. If you're watching wildlife, if you're trying to understand what wildlife are up to, you have to pay attention. You have to be patient. You have to take the time to watch. It doesn't get handed to you on a silver platter. You have to work to get that experience. And finally, I guess, make sure that you ask questions. Ask questions of yourself. Ask questions of the system. Ask questions of the people around you. Do your best to try and understand what's going on in the world around you. If you do that, I think life turns out to be so much more enjoyable. You get so much more out of it. It's just a wonderful thing to be able to experience some of the true treasures that we have in this country. And if you get the opportunity to go to South America or to go to Europe or to go to Africa or to Australia or New Guinea or wherever it happens to be, take advantage and use that opportunity to get a better understanding of how the world works.